Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel here, The Vital Dose. I'm Mike, and today we're diving into magnesium. But real quick, for those who don't know me, I'm a doctor of physical therapy and a board-certified exercise physiologist, among many other things. I've been here in the fitness, coaching, wellness realm for 13 years and counting, and I get increasingly fed up with the lack of quality information regarding dietetics, micronutrients, performance, and so forth. So as always, my intent is to provide you all with just higher tiers of knowledge and education using the science we have to the best of my ability. So without further ado, let's dive into magnesium. So what exactly is magnesium and why do we care about it? Magnesium is foundational to life. It's embedded in pretty much every single cellular process that goes on within our bodies. Powers over 600 enzymatic reactions, and it's a critical cofactor for ATP-dependent enzymes especially. Stabilizes DNA, RNA, and cell membranes, making it essential for structural integrity of those components. And magnesium also binds to ATP to form magnesium ATP, or MgATP, which is the actual energy-carrying molecule used within our cells. For shorthand, we typically just call it ATP, but it's actually MgATP. So without magnesium, even basic functions like muscle contractions, neuronal firing, your heart beating, protein synthesis, they just begin to fail and fall apart. So magnesium also regulates ion gradients for calcium, sodium, and potassium, which directly impacts muscle excitability, heart rhythm, nerve signal transmissions as well. It modulates NMDA receptor activity in the brain, acts as a natural buffer against overstimulation, helps to preserve neuroplasticity within the brain, and protects against excitotoxicity. It's one of the few minerals known to influence gene expression, immune signaling, as well as chronic inflammation through pathways like NF-κB. In the brain, magnesium supports stabilization of neuronal firing, protection against oxidative stress, maintenance of the blood-brain barrier integrity as well. In muscle cells, magnesium controls calcium release and reuptake, lactate buffering post-exercise, oxygen delivery, and vascular relaxation. It's also deeply involved in the immune system, helping to regulate T cell activation, macrophage responses, and cytokine release as well. It plays a major role in stress regulation, influencing the HPA axis and adrenal hormone synthesis too. Yet nearly 48% of Americans fall below the EAR for magnesium based on an NHANES data spanning from 2005 to 2016, of which we'll cover in a little bit because I really liked this kind of study here. The deficiency for magnesium is even worse in older adults, athletes, and then people eating highly processed diets, which here in America is about 71% of adults and about 67 to 73% of American adolescents, unfortunately. So why the shortfall in magnesium intake for most people? Most modern diets lack magnesium-rich foods, whole foods like leafy greens, legumes, seeds, and mineral-rich plants, which we'll definitely cover later. In general, our whole food sources, especially in America, are drastically limited in micronutrients by soil depletion, and perhaps more on that in another video. We also see a large percent of Americans reporting chronic overwhelm leading to health deficits, things like headaches, sleep changes, fatigue, so forth. I had a survey I found by the American Psychological Association. It's not like a full-on article, but it's on their page, and I guess we had about 3,000 American adults surveyed. Not a huge sample, but enough to say so. And about 76% reported like this kind of chronic overwhelm phenomenon, chronic stress, things like that. And we also see deficits in magnesium throughout our population from common medications that increase magnesium loss, such as loop diuretics, thiazide diuretics, proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, things like that. Bottom line, magnesium is critical and many people are unknowingly running low. A little more on that later too. Moving into section 2, we're going to cover magnesium and muscular performance. So magnesium is indispensable for skeletal muscle performance. Your muscles comprise over 25% of the body's magnesium stores, and the other like 60% and change in your bones, as well as other soft tissues and such. Magnesium serves as a cofactor for ATP-dependent enzymes binding to ATP, as we talked about before, to form that MgATP, which is the biologically active form of ATP. The long-handled name for this would be magnesium adenosine triphosphate. And this is the actual fuel that's used for muscular contraction and relaxation. So without magnesium, ATP is biologically inactive. Calcium reuptake into the sarcoplasmic reticulum of the muscle is drastically impaired, and the actin-myosin cross-bridge cycling slows down, making muscle contraction weaker and recovery slower between cross-bridge cycles. So during exercise, we see magnesium do a whole bunch of stuff. First and foremost, it stabilizes calcium gradients in myocytes or muscle cells, and magnesium helps control the movement of calcium into and out of the muscle cells themselves. As the trigger for muscle contraction, magnesium ensures that calcium levels stay balanced to prevent cramps, spasms, or excessive contraction. We also see magnesium help to regulate nerve-muscle communication through the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is the membrane that surrounds muscle cells in general, and magnesium supports the proper function of the ion channels in this membrane. So this in turn helps nerves send signals efficiently to muscles so that they contract at the right time with the right force. During exercise, magnesium also helps to maintain excitability and responsiveness of the neuromuscular junction. This is kind of where like a nerve connects to the muscle in essence, and magnesium helps to modulate the release of neurotransmitters and the sensitivity of these receptors at this junction. So this helps to ensure the muscle responds appropriately to nerve signals, critical for smooth, coordinated movement, nice fluid contractions. Things along those lines. So now we'll look at magnesium in high-level athletic and resistance training contexts. So strength training and hypertrophy demand rapid ATP turnover and precise calcium control, and magnesium can be a bottleneck for both. So optimal magnesium levels can improve contractile efficiency and reduce premature fatigue during sets. We see an enhanced rate of creatine phosphate cycling between heavier sets with adequate magnesium. We also see a decrease in delayed onset muscle soreness, also known as DOMS, by reducing post-training inflammation. We see support for fast twitch muscle recruitment, which is critical for explosive lifts, sprinting, and arguably maximal effort sets during training. We see an aid in neuromuscular coordination, leading to more effective reps under load, reduced inflammatory enzyme leakage of CK and LDH, especially after eccentric loading. And lastly, we see protection against oxidative stress, which accumulates in high volume or high intensity lifting blocks. Studies in strength athletes and powerlifters, see the citations, show supplementation of magnesium can improve maximal strength output or 1RM values. VO2 max and endurance under tension, or time to failure in bench press, for example, improve when magnesium is optimized as well. And magnesium seems to help buffer acidosis under high lactate training styles, so like supersets, drop sets, things like that. That's part of your training forte. So what happens if magnesium is insufficient? Even subclinical magnesium deficiency, where blood levels appear normal but tissues are undersupplied, can significantly impair performance and recovery. Immediate effects on performance that we might see would involve reduced mitochondrial ATP production. So without enough magnesium, mitochondria can't effectively produce ATP, leading to faster onset of fatigue during training. We also see slower recovery between sets with low ATP availability, so it slows the reuptake of calcium and the restoration of ion balances, leaving muscles sluggish with prolonging rest times. We also see increased muscle soreness. So magnesium, as we kind of mentioned above, is essential for clearing calcium from muscle fibers post-contraction. So when it's low, the calcium tends to linger, contributing to muscle tightness, soreness, and delayed recovery. And we lastly see a greater risk of injury. So magnesium helps to stabilize nerve signals, which we've kind of mentioned, and muscle responsiveness. Deficiency can lead to neuromuscular instability, increasing the chance of cramps, strains, or coordination-related injuries. Some of the longer-term impacts on adaptation with like chronically low or insufficient magnesium, if you will, again, even if it's subclinical, we see weakened strength and hypertrophy gains. So magnesium is involved in anabolic signaling pathways like mTOR, and without it, your body struggles to respond to training stimuli effectively. We also see compromised protein synthesis. So the machinery that builds muscle, aka ribosomes, relies on magnesium to function. So deficiency in magnesium means slower, less efficient muscle repair and growth. Disrupted sleep and hormone production too can also be a byproduct of magnesium insufficiency. So we see better deep sleep with adequate magnesium and better regulatory stress hormones. So inadequate levels can impair recovery by reducing growth hormone and testosterone release during sleep. And more on sleep with magnesium a little later into our video here. Lastly, we'll cover performance and relevant signs of deficiency. So we kind of dove above into just what you might see during training and such, but I'll kind of give a little brief overview of all of this in layman's terms. So day-to-day insufficiency of magnesium, we might see muscle cramping, twitching during or after workouts, feeling fatigued early into the workout, even with adequate nutrition and hydration, prolonged soreness or poor recovery from moderate sessions, elevated heart rate or erratic pulse under heavy loads, drop in peak power output or endurance and compound movements, inability to kind of like get in the zone or poor mind-muscle connection, CNS fatigue, things like that. So those are some of the red flags you might experience day to day with suboptimal intracellular magnesium levels, which your blood tests may miss. Moving into section 3, we're going to cover some of the neurotransmitter roles of magnesium in brain performance. So magnesium has a foundational role in the brain. It's indispensable for optimal brain functioning, influences mood regulation, stress resilience, cognitive performance, memory consolidation, and especially neuroplasticity, which if you don't know, it's the brain's ability to adapt and form new connections, memories, things like that. It acts as a cofactor for more than 300 enzymes, many of which govern neurotransmitter synthesis, synaptic signaling, and neuronal membrane stability. So magnesium supports ionic homeostasis in the brain, especially for calcium and potassium. For calcium, it plays a critical role in neurotransmitter release in general. And for potassium, it's essential for resting membrane potential and repolarization, if you kind of think back to biology. Without adequate magnesium, neurons become hyper-excitable, poorly regulated, and vulnerable to oxidative damage and overstimulation. So magnesium also plays a role at the NMDA receptor. So its most protective neurological role, it's a natural NMDA receptor antagonist. So NMDA receptors are activated by glutamate, the brain's most abundant excitatory neurotransmitter. Under normal conditions, magnesium blocks the NMDA receptor at resting membrane potential. So it's like a voltage-dependent plug almost. It only allows calcium to pass when absolutely needed. With magnesium deficiency, this plug is kind of removed prematurely, and we see like calcium just racing into the neurons, basically. It's like uncontrolled. And this gives us excessive firing and excitotoxicity. So a surge in reactive oxygen species and mitochondrial stress as well. So you kind of loop this process hundreds, thousands of times throughout the day or over the years. We see a correlation, if you will, or a link to anxiety disorders, depression, cognitive decline, epilepsy, and other glutamate-driven excitotoxicity-based conditions, and neuroinflammatory conditions like MS and TBI, believe it or not. Obviously, TBI wouldn't be acquired just from magnesium deficiency, but there's more of a pronounced effect status post-TBI if someone has had a TBI or traumatic brain injury. Magnesium essentially protects neurons from overactivation, if that makes sense. So it allows the brain to signal efficiently, like without burnout. So that's critical. For BDNF and memory synaptic plasticity, BDNF is brain-derived neurotropic factor for those that don't know, and it's a protein crucial for neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons, synaptic plasticity, which modifies existing connections of neurons, and long-term potentiation, or LTP, which is the foundation of newer memory storage. So magnesium plays a role in upregulating BDNF expression, particularly in the hippocampus, where the memories are kind of formed in the brain, or the memory hub of the brain. We also see a promotion of dendritic branching with magnesium when it's adequate, enhancing synaptic communication. So the brain just kind of fires better altogether when magnesium is not deficient or it's optimal. So for animal models, some of the research that I have down below looked at elevated brain magnesium. We see an increase in synaptic density, reverses conditions like Alzheimer's or other synaptic degradation-based conditions, and improves spatial memory and learning tasks. And in human studies, we see optimal magnesium levels associated with greater executive function and attention, improved emotional regulation, especially under pressure, lower incidence of cognitive fatigue and burnout, and lastly, enhanced resilience in high stress or high cognitive load environments like military stuff, academia, athletic performance, and so forth. So we have a better, happier, more resilient brain overall with magnesium involved. So some of this will be parts and pieces we've already covered, but I'm going to try to put all this together. So neurotransmitter systems modulated by magnesium. So again, we've kind of done bits and pieces of some of these, but I figured it would be helpful to kind of put it all together and include some ones we have yet to talk about. So magnesium is involved in the biosynthesis, receptor sensitivity, and reuptake regulation of multiple key neurotransmitters, like we've kind of alluded to. We mentioned GABA, but we'll go into it now. So GABA, or the brain's brake pedal, if you will, magnesium enhances GABA A receptor function, which promotes inhibitory neurotransmission and calms down the CNS. So GABA is critical for sleep onset, anxiety control, and focus under distraction. So pretty important stuff. Low magnesium, we see reduced GABAergic tone, resulting in restlessness or over-arousal, insomnia or light fragmented sleep, sensory hypersensitivity, heightened startle reflex, or emotional lability. For serotonin, it's more of our like emotional stability and motivation neurotransmitter, I guess you can call it. The enzyme tryptophan hydroxylase, which converts tryptophan into serotonin, is magnesium dependent, believe it or not. So serotonin itself regulates mood stability, motivation, resilience, appetite, and circadian rhythm. So a decrease or low level of magnesium leading potentially to low serotonin, we might see apathetic mood, increased rumination, irritability, disruptive cortisol regulation via the HPA axis, or like worsening stress. So for dopamine, that's more of our focus, reward, and drive-based neurotransmitter. Magnesium influences dopamine receptor sensitivity, D1, D2, and dopamine transporter efficiency, or DAT. Deficiency in magnesium, in regards to dopamine anyways, may cause reduced attention span, diminished reward sensitivity, mental fatigue, or even with adequate sleep, we still might have a mental fatigue or lethargy, and decreased novelty seeking or joy in achievement. So we're kind of flat in that regard. Other common symptoms of subclinical magnesium deficiency in the brain. So even without a diagnosed neurological disorder, chronic low magnesium may present with brain fog, forgetfulness, or poor working memory, trouble concentrating or focusing under stress, low stress thresholds or irritability, short fuse type reactions, however you want to phrase it, loss of motivation, creativity, or resilience, so kind of earlier signs of burnout, if you will, difficulty falling asleep or waking up unrefreshed despite 7 or 8 hours in bed, fatigue that's unresponsive to caffeine, sleep, or rest, mild depression or anxiety, especially in high stimulation-based environments. So who are some of the populations that might be most vulnerable when it comes to magnesium deficiency and kind of suffer the most mentally? I would argue chronic stress individuals, and some of this is anecdote, some of this is research backed, but chronic stress individuals with high cortisol, we tend to see a higher magnesium loss. Alcohol users, we see a magnesium wasting effect with use of alcohol chronically. People on PPIs, or proton pump inhibitors, as well as diuretics, as we see a flushing of magnesium sometimes. ADHD or anxiety spectrum-based populations with higher glutamate signaling. And lastly, aging adults, or pretty much anyone over the age of 25 to 30. Magnesium absorption declines even further with older age as well. And we'll kind of get into some of the lab diagnostics and such in section 6, ideal therapeutic ranges, targeted supplementation strategies, and so forth. But I wanted to cover a good section here on just the brain itself and a lot of the neurotransmitter involvement with magnesium because it is such a staple and so critically important for healthier brain function. Moving into section 4, we're going to cover magnesium and cardiovascular health. So magnesium is a cornerstone mineral for cardiovascular function, exerting influence across blood pressure control, vascular tone in general, heart rate rhythm regulation, arterial flexibility, and anti-inflammatory signaling, among many other things for the heart. Core roles in the cardiovascular system: magnesium acts as a natural calcium antagonist. It blocks excess calcium influx into vascular, smooth muscle cells, thereby preventing vasoconstriction. Also serves as a cofactor in ATP synthesis and energy transfer, especially vital for high-demand organs like the heart. Magnesium also maintains electrolyte homeostasis, like we talked about above, which modulates the delicate balance between potassium and calcium ions, as well as sodium ions, during each heartbeat, which of course for the heart is incredibly critical. So in regards to vascular tone and endothelial health, magnesium directly supports the health of blood vessels by promoting vascular smooth muscle relaxation via inhibition of calcium-mediated contraction. So we see a stimulation in nitric oxide, or NO, synthesis as well in endothelial cells, which is crucial for vasodilation, improved blood flow, and stable blood pressure regulation. When magnesium is deficient or low, we can see endothelial dysfunction develop, aka a key early step in atherosclerosis. We see nitrous oxide production decrease, impairing vasodilation. And lastly, oxidative stress will rise within the vessel wall. Inflammatory mediators like TNF-alpha and IL-6 increase, leading to vascular stiffening, accelerated plaque formation, and greater cardiovascular event risk. Regards to blood pressure regulation, magnesium has been shown to modestly but consistently lower blood pressure, particularly in folks with hypertension, those with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, and people with low baseline magnesium status. So how this occurs, or the mechanism in which magnesium can do this, is, again, we kind of mentioned above, but it improves endothelial function and vasodilation. We also see an inhibition of angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, which in turn reduces vasoconstrictive tone as well. And we also see a lowering of systemic inflammation, which in general can contribute to arterial stiffness. And lastly, we see enhanced vascular compliance, so the ability of the vessels to kind of stretch and recoil as needed with changes in fluctuation. So I have a little meta-analysis here by Zhang et al. From 2016. They had 34 randomized controlled trials, looked at a total of roughly 2,028 folks across all of the trials. We saw with adequate and effective dosaging of magnesium, so they looked at 300 to 600 milligrams daily of elemental magnesium administered across 8 weeks of consistent use daily, led to more sustained effects. So what they found was a decrease in systolic blood pressure by about 4.18 millimeters of mercury and a diastolic decrease of about 2 millimeters of mercury, which I know that's not massive, but for somebody that's right in that threshold of hypertension or prehypertension, it could be enough to kind of change the game. So the best results with magnesium supplementation were seen in hypertensive individuals, like we mentioned, pre-diabetic or metabolic syndrome folks, and those with just general low serum magnesium, which again, we kind of mentioned above. But it was neat to see that with such a small change of an over-the-counter supplement of elemental magnesium, we can actually see a consistent drop in blood pressure due to all the factors we've already mentioned. And we covered who would kind of benefit the most, but I had a few more populations to add to that. So we covered hypertensive adults, individuals with metabolic issues or insulin resistance, postmenopausal women who faced increased arterial calcification risk, overweight and obese individuals, often with inflammation-driven vascular impairment, and then just general pop who's just magnesium deficient due to poor diet, poor lifestyle, things like that. So some clinical insight is all the groups we've kind of mentioned that magnesium would have a pretty, we'll call it a moderate effect on in terms of reduction of blood pressure and other cardiovascular issues. All these groups share common traits. They probably have an elevated baseline blood pressure, underlying magnesium deficiency, whether it's serum or intracellular, and they probably have features of cardiometabolic syndrome. Therefore, it's a low risk, high impact intervention to include some sort of additional magnesium supplementation in the daily use for these individuals. So now we'll move into oxidative stress and atherogenesis. Magnesium plays a protective role against atherosclerosis, like we mentioned above, which is the process behind most heart attacks and strokes, to keep it really simple. Deficiency of magnesium, we mentioned some of these, but we'll dive in a little more detail now, is we see contribution to LDL oxidations. That's a key step in plaque formation, and no LDL is not automatically the criminal. They're kind of the policemen per se that are called to the scene. There's a lot of other underlying things that contribute to this, but we'll kind of keep it there for this video anyways. Deficiency of magnesium also leads to mitochondrial oxidative stress, which we sort of mentioned, in vascular endothelial cells, endothelial damage in general, which facilitates the calling of the LDL police and the cholesterol buildup. Magnesium tends to support antioxidant enzymes like superoxide dismutase, or SOD, as well as glutathione peroxidase. We see a suppression of NADPH oxidase, which is a major generator of free radicals inside arteries themselves. So this long-term deficiency in magnesium, we're going to get those stiff, inflexible arteries, endothelial erosion and poor repair mechanisms, as well as calcified plaque deposits, increasing the risk of myocardial infarction and stroke. So now we'll shift into electrolyte balance and cardiac rhythm. So magnesium is essential for maintaining normal heart rhythm, which we alluded to in the very beginning of this section, acting in tandem with potassium, calcium, as well as sodium, which in turn helps to stabilize the action potentials in the cardiac myocytes, voltage-gated ion channels across heart cell membranes. So deficiency in magnesium, we tend to see maybe AFib or other ventricular arrhythmias depending. So who are our most at-risk populations for cardiovascular issues per se in terms of deficiency with magnesium? So critically ill patients in ICU settings, refeeding syndrome in malnourished individuals, athletes with significant sweat and electrolyte loss, and people with chronic diarrhea or diuretic use due to the flushing of magnesium. So in short, magnesium supplementation can help prevent arrhythmias, restore sinus rhythm or normal heart rate and normal heartbeat and normal heart rhythm, and protect against sudden cardiac death at high-risk individuals. Bottom line from this section for the heart, magnesium is not just heart protective, it's rhythm regulating, pressure balancing, vessel stabilizing, and anti-inflammatory in general. It belongs in the cardiovascular conversation alongside potassium, omega-3s, and statins as well, if you tend to lead towards statins, which these days I personally do not, but that's for another video. Now we'll dive into section 5, which will cover magnesium's role in liver, kidney, and systemic detoxification. So for those that don't know, the liver is your body's primary detoxification hub, responsible for filtering blood, deactivating hormones, metabolizing drugs, and converting toxins into excretable compounds. So magnesium supports both major detox phases. Phase 1, which is the cytochrome P450 enzyme activation pathway, and then phase 2, the conjugation pathways. We'll cover both. So for phase 1, magnesium serves as a cofactor and stabilizer for the cytochrome P450 enzyme system, which in turn supports hydroxylation reactions, which are critical for modifying xenobiotics or any foreign chemicals, processing steroids and estrogen, and preparing fat-soluble toxins for neutralization. For the phase 2, the conjugation conjugation pathway. This includes glucuronidation, sulfation, and glutathione conjugation. So all of which require ATP, which depends on magnesium to form the Mg ATP we covered in the very beginning, which again, as we know, the only bioavailable form of cell energy. So magnesium powers the conversion of the reactive intermediates into water-soluble forms that can either be excreted via bile or urine or safely eliminated without recirculating back into tissues. So consequences of liver magnesium deficiency: an increase in those pesky reactive oxygen species, or ROS, and we've talked about oxidative injury leading to hepatocytes before. An increase in the reactive oxygen species, which in turn can, in the liver anyways, lead to increased oxidative injury to the hepatocytes, which are the cells primarily in the liver, mitochondrial dysfunction or energy collapse, and hepatocellular death. Not good. And the progression of NAFLD, or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which in turn we see steatosis, fibrosis, and potential cirrhosis is kind of the pathway that would follow. And lastly, glutathione depletion comprise antioxidant defense and impaired phase 2 detox. So we talked about that conjugation pathway. Glutathione is one of the primary mechanisms within that pathway that helps to improve or keep up our antioxidant defense, and we would see this compromised with a magnesium deficiency. So magnesium is central not only to toxin elimination, but also the liver's structural and metabolic resilience. Moving into kidneys. Kidneys, for some that don't know, are the body's magnesium regulator, but also depend on magnesium for protection against toxicity, fibrosis, and other vascular stress. So key renal roles of magnesium: reabsorption in the nephron. So magnesium is filtered and reabsorbed primarily in the loop of Helene within the kidney via the TRPM6 and TRPM7 channels. And preservation of systemic magnesium status in turn prevents urinary depletion. So vascular regulation acts as a calcium antagonist, promoting renal vasodilation and healthy glomerular filtration of the kidney. So if we see deficiency of magnesium within the kidney, we may see damage to the glomerular system and early signs of CKD, or chronic kidney disease, which would look like proteinuria, which is protein or increased amount of protein within the urine, impaired filtration of the kidneys, and fibrotic changes in the kidney architecture. We'd also see increased inflammation and activation of the NF-κB and TLR4 signaling pathways, and accelerated CKD progression, like we said above, or chronic kidney disease progression. Lastly, we'd see calcium phosphate imbalance. So low magnesium within the kidney would lead to a higher serum calcium and phosphate balance. So vascular calcification would kind of be a downside to this, which would be very dangerous in dialysis patients. Within the kidney itself too, with deficiency of magnesium, we see an increased vulnerability to nephrotoxins. So magnesium mitigates renal damage from NSAIDs, heavy metals, contrast dyes, all sorts of things like that. We would see an inability of the kidney to kind of process and eliminate some of those things as well. Moving next into magnesium and systemic inflammation or oxidative stress, we'll talk about some of the metabolic protective effects of magnesium. So in general, chronic inflammation, amplification without adequate magnesium. So we'd see, we talked about this with the kidney, but we'd see an increase in activation of the NF-κB pathway, or a transcription factor that turns on the body's inflammatory mechanism. So with magnesium deficiency, we'd see an activation of the NF-κB signaling pathway, which is a transcription factor that turns on the body's inflammatory machinery. In turn, this gives us an upregulation of IL-6, TNF-alpha, CRP, and MCP1, which are some major inflammatory kind of creators, if you will, to keep it really simple for time being. These cytokines sustain a low-grade inflammatory state in the body, and over time lead to that arterial stiffness we talked about with the heart, immune overactivation, insulin resistance, and neuroinflammation in general, which we talked about with the brain. So oxidative stress and antioxidant collapse. Magnesium is essential for maintaining endogenous antioxidant systems, including glutathione peroxidase, which we mentioned within the liver, superoxidase dismutase, or SOD, and catalase. So without magnesium, these reactive oxygen species levels accumulate, they keep increasing, and they go unchecked. We see other cellular components within the body become oxidized, including lipids, DNA, and proteins, which in turn gives us faster aging with worse neurodegeneration or increasing rates of neurodegeneration, increased risk for cancer, CVD, or cardiovascular disease, as well as mitochondrial dysfunction in general. So super critical to have our adequate levels of magnesium in order to keep all of these things in check. And one last little addition for the brain in terms of protection: the blood-brain barrier integrity is heavily reliant on magnesium as it strengthens the tight junctions between the endothelial cells of the blood-brain barrier. So in deficiency of magnesium, these blood-brain barrier junctions loosen, and we see toxins and inflammatory cytokines leak into the brain. So that would give us that neuroinflammation, the cognitive fog or fatigue, mood instability, and of course, the increased risk for neurodegenerative diseases within the brains like Parkinson's. We've mentioned briefly insulin resistance and other metabolic dysfunctions. So magnesium itself, though, is a direct modulator of insulin signaling. It enhances insulin receptor phosphorylation, supports glucose uptake into muscle cells, and reduces oxidative stress in pancreatic beta cells. So when magnesium is deficient, we see insulin sensitivity decline, blood glucose rise due to compensatory hyperinsulinemia, and inflammatory cytokines further block these insulin pathways. So it's a very vicious cycle that's created. We get inflammation increases with insulin resistance. We get insulin resistance which worsens with inflammation. And then lastly, we get visceral fat expansion, secreting even more of these cytokines. So you can kind of see the whirlpool of very poor effects forming here. And we get the result of metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and increased risk of cardiovascular and neurodegenerative things. I'm guessing you're seeing the trend. So that's more or less magnesium's role in protection in some of the organ systems, as well as the brain, kidney, liver, and so forth within the body. All right, moving into section 6, we're going to start to cover optimizing magnesium intake, supplementation, dosing, timing strategies, all that kind of stuff. So let's talk first about the gap between the RDA and actual optimal intake levels of magnesium. So the RDA basically is designed to prevent like deficiency symptoms in most common, I'd argue, sedentary, average, and we'll say American people. It's not really meant to optimize performance or resilience or keep things like top shape, if that makes sense, in terms of magnesium intake. So for the average American male, the RDA recommends 400 to 420 milligrams of magnesium daily. And for women, about 310 to 320 milligrams of magnesium daily for their average adult. However, we talked about above that nearly 48% of US adults fail to even meet the estimated like RDA, let alone beyond. So who would we typically see full-on deficiency in? Most likely it's going to be athletes due to a higher turnover of magnesium, and some of this we already covered. Older adults in general due to a lower absorption rate and higher renal excretion of magnesium, potentially due to medications and things like that. Lastly, chronic stress-based populations due to HPA axis activation, which I did think we mentioned above. And I've got one more. Those that have ultra processed diets. So I think at the very beginning we said, which is pretty much 70% and 75% plus of average American adults and kids combined. So almost everybody, large amount of people here. So why is there this deficit in general? Let's talk about the fitness folks first. So kind of covered it above, but elevated magnesium loss through sweat and urine. For those that train very highly, post-exercise uptake into muscle cells, we'd see depletion in serum levels temporarily anyways. And then the glycolytic style training increases the intracellular magnesium demand. Therefore, there's less of it going around in serum. For the physiological or psychological stress people, rather, we see activation of the HPA axis elevating cortisol levels. And we talked about how it directly increases renal magnesium excretion, having elevated cortisol levels chronically. And then lastly, we did mention meds, but I'll mention them again. So magnesium wasting-based medications, diuretics, PPIs, oral contraceptives too. And those that abuse caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine daily. We see an increased ability to absorb magnesium with these drugs when they're used chronically. Caffeine, I'd argue, we're talking 900 plus milligrams daily, which is pretty up there, but alcohol and nicotine, even at low to moderate doses daily, 2 to 3 drinks, and nicotine I don't really have a dosage for, couldn't really find one, but we could see, we'll call it nicotine abuse, whatever that would constitute as, impaired magnesium absorption and or increased loss through urinary excretion, especially with use of alcohol. So dietary trends we see today, we've talked in other videos and this one too about the reduction of magnesium-rich components in food, a German brand with bread, the lack of consumption of like leafy greens, legumes, nuts, mineral-rich seeds, soil depletion, especially in America, and higher phosphorus and protein diets. We might also see increased magnesium excretion. So that's kind of the modern dietary reasons, if you will, why most folks are probably deficient. And I mean average folks for that too, let alone the special populations we just mentioned up above. So now we'll get into the more optimal intake of magnesium. I do have a chart for you guys here, so I'll toss this up on the screen. Let's see what we got. Yeah, so I mean, Sedentary adults with stress, I guess the optimal intake was recorded to be about 400 to 600 milligrams magnesium daily. Recreational based athletes, like your average gym goer who's maybe into a couple fitness classes a week or some light training, daily walking, things like that, 600, 800 milligrams daily is probably sufficient to be more towards optimal. Your strength training athletes or endurance-based athletes, so those that take things a little more seriously, push the envelope a little bit harder, things like that, we're looking at 800 to 1200 milligrams daily. And again, that would probably be the lower end of the optimal intake, if you will. Elite athletes in burnout and recovery, people that are chronically burnt out, we're looking at 1200 to about 2000 milligrams daily. And of course, most of these are split dosing, and we'll talk about that down below. Yeah, that's more or less our optimal dosing. I would argue, again, those are probably lower end of optimal dosing for those populations, just based on anecdotal stuff, but that's what the literature shows anyways. So we'll get into some of the split dosing stuff in a bit here. We're going to go through food first approach. I know I've only had a couple videos out, but I'm big into food first approach due to the bioavailability of cofactors within foods, whole foods, such as fiber, polyphenols, flavonoids, which I did cover extensively in the vitamin C deep dive. But more or less, cofactors, for those that don't know, are kind of like little extra building blocks within your food, other substrates or molecules that help to process and digest the magnesium more optimally, making it more bioavailable upon intake. So I have another chart here. I kind of did like the top 10 highest level foods of magnesium. So we'll start off here with pumpkin seeds, which ironically enough, per 1 ounce, which isn't a terrible amount of seeds, but it's enough to say so. We're looking at 150 to 170 milligrams magnesium, and I won't read through all of these. Most notably, I wanted to comment on spinach. I think in my own research and review and with social media, I've seen a lot of people say, oh, like, you have a couple handfuls of spinach a day, you're good to go. You need about 9 bags of raw spinach to get close to some of the optimal levels. So I don't think that's entirely true. This is, again, based on literature. But you can see we've got almonds, black beans, avocados, dark chocolate, tofu, cashews, and quinoa, some of the top 10 or higher sources of magnesium. Of course, these aren't the only ones, but I'd argue these are probably more common foods that folks tend to have in their diet on a daily basis. So again, I will not read through all of these, but I will post this chart. I'll break it in half, 5 and 5, and you guys can pause here if you want to take a peek at it. But again, we're trying to sum the amount of food we're eating to get us to like that 1000 to 2000 milligram range, especially if we're athletes or if we're resistance training. The other thing I would like to mention is that it's really hard to get all of our magnesium through our diet. Therefore, supplementation with this particular mineral kind of becomes a must. And we're going to get into that now. So realistically, like, you could argue maybe 300 to 500, maybe 700 milligrams daily you can actually consume through your diet through whole foods. That still leaves us with anywhere from like 1000 to 1300 left to supplement. So we'll talk about that now. Alrighty, so I have a big long chart here. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I wanted to include all of the forms of magnesium that are kind of recognized through supplementation that are out there. And then I'll go into, maybe we'll call them the top 3 forms of magnesium supplementation, the forms that they come in, the percent that's elemental per gram, which is more or less what you're actually chasing, and then the recommended dosing strategy. And again, even if this gets you closer than you are, chances are you will reap some sort of benefit from this. So let's go through the big long chart, or at least parts and pieces of it. Starting off first and foremost with magnesium bisglycinate, very high bioavailability, and I do have percentages in the top 3 chart down below, so I'll comment on those later. Best use cases are listed here, and then the absorption's a little more gentle on the GI tract, which is kind of the main appeal. And it's fairly rapidly absorbed too, if I recall. Arguably, it's the best source of magnesium to supplement with, I would say. Anyways, you might also see it called magnesium glycinate, but just be careful for lower quality blends. They're not always fully chelated, aka the best kind of quality they can be per supplement. So bisglycinate's probably your best bet. Next, you'll see magnesium malate, magnesium L-threonate, magnesium taurate, magnesium citrate, chlorate, sulfate, and a few others here. I won't read all of them. I would, again, probably stick with the malate, the bisglycinate, and potentially the L-threonate. So yeah, you can see some of the effects, if you will, here in the chart, and I'll make this a little more concise, but I will include the entire chart. This way you guys can kind of go through it and see what else is out there, on Amazon or wherever you might shop if you're looking for third-party tested supplements. At this time, I have no affiliation with any company out there or anything, but I know that some do exist that offer very good, hearty third-party testing confirmation of like what you're getting is what you're actually getting versus just buying the cheapest thing off Amazon. You're not really guaranteed that that's actually what's inside those capsules or tablets or whatever form you might take it in. So let's dive into kind of the top 3 forms for higher dose magnesium. So we talked about percentages of elemental magnesium per gram, which is what we're actually after. So the bisglycinate tends to be the highest or near the highest at 14 to 20% elemental magnesium per gram of bisglycinate. The absorption is incredibly high. The bioavailability is incredibly high. And then we would probably split dose this 2 to 3, 3 to 4 doses daily. Again, if you're getting, 500-600 milligrams in your diet, then we're looking at maybe 3 additional doses of this per day. Personally, I tend to take about 1,000 milligrams in the morning, 1,000 milligrams in the afternoons, and I have no gastric issues with bisglycinate, malate, or taurate, but that's just me. You might be different, but again, the more we can kind of break up this dosing, chances are the better the bioavailability is too. And we have like kind of a constant influx into serum, which could also be beneficial. But if you're one who takes different supplements with different meals, then so be it. But I think twice a day is probably sufficient for most people with, again, just an increase in absorption that they're probably already getting at baseline. So anything helps at this rate with magnesium. Malate is very similar, and then taurate would be probably about the same. But I would argue malate and bisglycinate are probably the way to go. And the split dosing would pretty much be the same. So if we're looking for that 1,200 to 2,000 milligrams and we're not really sure what's coming through the diet, again, 3 to 4 doses of the 300 to 400 milligrams daily is probably more than sufficient for all or most. And some folks, again, can just tolerate a higher dosing, like a split dosing twice per day, maybe 800 to 1,000 milligrams depending. So I have a little chart here, just kind of some forms of magnesium to use a little more strategically. I would personally say this isn't something I subscribe to or have played around with, but I found it interesting that literature kind of looked at this, so I wanted to include it. But more or less, we see L-threonate, lower elemental yield, a little bit better for the brain to process, but perhaps not the best for replenishing, decreased levels of magnesium in general. Citrate itself, some say it's a laxative above 300 to 400 milligrams. I have used citrate in the past myself, anecdotally, at much higher dosages with zero GI issues, but for some folks, it clears you right out. So keep that in mind if you're going to supplement with the citrate. Maybe keep those dosages a little bit lower and split dose throughout the day. Oxide, sulfate, and carbonate, poor absorption and not appropriate for high dose systemic needs. I personally don't even know of any supplements off the top of my head that include any of these 3 forms of magnesium, but of course they exist and of course they're sold. I just have no experience, but this was again from the literature. So here is another little chart of kind of a sample breakdown in dosing. If you want to get real fancy, I don't personally think there's a massive need for the average person or even fairly intense gym goer who's not an elite level competitor to supplement with different forms of magnesium. I guess you could argue some might be better for sleep in the evening. Some might give you less gastric upset, so those might be beneficial to take during the day. But again, a split dose of the bisglycinate tends to be tolerated by most, even 2 to 3 dosings per day of 300 to 400 milligrams. That's probably, if I have when I make anecdotal recommendations to clients and folks I review blood work for, that is pretty much what seems to address this deficiency for most people with the best tolerance. So that's my anecdote for that. Cool. And let's get into, let's see. Oh, I did include a little chart on timing that the literature kind of spoke to. So I'll put this up on the screen too. So these are, again, if you're going to supplement with different forms, you want to get real meticulous. The morning, we see magnesium malate or citrate, the best boost for cellular energy, glucose metabolism per the research. Pre-workout, magnesium malate for the same kind of reasons, cramp prevention and neuromuscular performance improvements. Taurate and malate, post-workout as well for recovery, lactate clearance, and muscle ATP regeneration. And then lastly, the evening, glycinate, bisglycinate, or L-threonate for that GABAergic tone for improved sleep quality. I have not personally played with the supplemental forms at nighttime, so I don't really have much anecdote to shed there, but this is something that I have read and seen a lot out on social media and other YouTube channels and such that people do talk about. Bisglycinate, I usually take around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I haven't really tried it just before bed, but maybe I will just to kind of see what happens. I also don't usually have a lot of trouble falling and staying asleep, so it's not something I've had to troubleshoot for myself. And for others, it's not a recommendation I've made, but I'm not opposed to having folks try. But that little chart I found interesting too. So let's look at our overall little cheat sheet for matching daily goals with magnesium. One last little chart here before we get into section 7 on blood markers, deficiency, and things like that. And I won't really read through this. I'll just post it up there for you guys. But again, something you can take a peek at and maybe help give you some structure or a better idea of what we're looking for. In essence, I think with magnesium, anecdotally, and from what I've gone through with the literature here, something is better than nothing. More to a certain extent is better than not enough. Again, upwards of that 2,000 milligrams or a little bit more than that seems to be well tolerated by most. I wouldn't go pumping yourself full of 600, 10,000 milligrams, you probably will have some gastric distress among other issues and hyper magnesium based serum and potentially intracellular levels. I will not get into side effects on that stuff here, but yeah, I would argue again, more is better than not enough, and split dose 2-3 times a day is probably ample for most people on top of a fairly well-balanced diet with leafy greens, potentially some pumpkin seeds and things along those lines. So this time that's pretty much it for section 6. We'll dive into blood work markers, deficiency symptoms, and the clinical impact of deficient magnesium status now. So section 7 here is going to kind of give us a global roundup of everything we've discussed above. A lot of stuff I know I kind of mentioned in different sections of the video. It was tricky not to have so much overlap because yes, everything's connected in the body, of course, but there is a lot of overlap and it just kind of is what it is. But I think section 7 will tie in a large part of all of the functions of magnesium, especially subclinically within the body. So let's get into the clinical signs and symptoms of magnesium deficiency and kind of what you might see. So in general, we know magnesium's critical for cell stability, energy metabolism, nerve conduction, cardiovascular rhythm, and electrolyte regulation, all the things we've kind of mentioned in piecework above. And even slight deficits in magnesium, we can see some decently widespread dysfunction. So we'll kind of go system by system here. I do have another chart. I'll break this up. So neuromuscularly, clinically, you get the muscle cramping, twitches, tremors, spasms, chronic fatigue. And of course, before I go any further, you might see this manifest with other deficiencies in electrolytes and other deficiencies in different vitamins and minerals. But if you see these signs and symptoms with things clinically or subclinically, whatever, you might just want to make a note, okay, let's look into magnesium status, right? And the lay explanation for neuromusculars, we know that magnesium helps muscles relax after contraction, and deficiency leads to cramps or like overactivity, twitching, fatigue, even with light activity. Neurologically, we mentioned this a little bit with the brain section there. We see potentially an increase in anxiety, brain fog, irritability, depression, and insomnia. And we know that magnesium modulates GABA, serotonin, and dopamine. Low levels can amplify stress, mood swings, and disrupt sleep cycles in general. Some of that we touched on during the brain section above. Cardiovascularly, we talked about palpitations, arrhythmias, and higher blood pressure. And we also discussed the electrical rhythm of the heart. It's magnesium dependent, and we might see irregularities in magnesium deficiency. Metabolically speaking, we talked about insulin resistance occurrence, lower potassium levels due to increased excretion, and potentially lower calcium levels too. And magnesium helps activate insulin receptors and regulates other electrolytes. Deficiency can worsen blood sugar and electrolyte balance, which I think we've kind of pieced together too. Musculoskeletally, directly, exercise intolerance, chronic soreness, delayed recovery, and I would even argue impaired performance and increased fatigue as well. I think we have that underneath neuromuscular, but I'd argue it fits here too. And we know that magnesium is that fitting block, if you will, for the fuel of ATP production. And we see basically poor lactate clearance with a deficit in magnesium as well. So that lingering soreness and recovery stalling. Immune and inflammatory modulators on blood work itself, you might see elevated CRP, frequent illness, things along those lines. And magnesium deficiency activates, again, that chronic inflammatory path, NFKB, driving inflammation and weakening immune defense. On blood work itself, we might kind of just see some of those elevated systemic markers and then maybe a drastic decrease in serum if you're testing for it directly. It's kind of hard to test intracellular levels themselves directly, and someone else might say, no, it's not. But in my experience with general labs and ordering your own panels and having clients that do the same thing and kind of dissecting these, I haven't really seen a good metric to assess intracellular levels of magnesium. So serum is kind of what we have to go with. And we'll move into magnesium deficiencies with athletics and gen pop, a little more of a lower end system tie. So this is kind of parts and pieces of all the things we pieced together throughout this entire video. I just wanted to give you guys like one concise chart with some of the other odds and ends. So the decrease in mitochondrial function when in a state of magnesium deficiency, we know we get that decreased ATP generation, the premature fatigue, and I'll leave the lay explanations there so you guys can take a peek at them. We also see that HPA axis dysregulation, those for our chronic stress folks, poor stress recovery, wired but tired state, just that chronic awake and alert and oriented state, but also fatigued at the same time. Inflammatory cytokines, we've mentioned a bunch of these today. We also talked about the NFKB pathway for chronic systemic inflammation. We might also see an elevation in IL-6 or activation of these pathways, and TNF-alpha pathway as well. Again, those are those chronic inflammatory cytokines. Could be seen with HS-CRP testing on blood work, or it could be a little bit elevated with other inflammatory-based markers. And these guys themselves, these are the ones that lead to those damaged vessels, neurons, and things like that when they go unchecked, and that's something we talked about throughout the video too. Next, we see with deficiency of magnesium, a decrease in endothelial nitric oxide. We talked about that leading to increased vascular stiffness, so less compliant arterioles and blood vessels, resulting in an elevated blood pressure itself. Neurotransmitter imbalance, mood issues, all of that stuff, and then the GABA requirement for magnesium. And lastly, to hit the nail on the head one more time, insulin receptor desensitization with a deficiency of magnesium. So we're going to see like the metabolic markers kind of elevate, blood sugar instability, increases in belly fat and potentially visceral fat and other metabolic based issues. So we'll get into, I have a couple insights I wanted to go through and just some key research things I liked for deficiency with magnesium, and I'll drop those guys down here at the end of the video. I didn't really know where else to put them. So even with subclinical magnesium deficiency, mildly decreased serum levels basically in blood, we have a higher risk of cardiovascular mortality. I don't have a percentage or like a number for that. That's from Zhang et al. 2017. If you guys want to go through the study, feel free. Increased rates of depression and mood disorders, and increased risk of type 2 diabetes and glycemic control. And that was pretty significant, I guess, too. And that was Hrubby et al. 2014 for the risk of diabetes, if you want to check that out in the citations. And then next we saw deficiency of magnesium. We had a nice little cohort study of over 16,000 people, which was kind of cool. Lowered red blood cell magnesium is correlated with increased systemic inflammatory markers and CRP. Again, that increased fasting glucose and hypertension prevalence. So we're just seeing an overlap of the same cardiovascular, cardiometabolic issues and chronic inflammation states with a deficiency in magnesium. I want to say we covered most of this stuff, like way too much. Yeah, another study confirming the same thing. This was a meta-analysis by Rosenoff and Plesset in 2013. Same thing, higher type 2 diabetic incidence, higher increase of cardiovascular events, and higher risk of all-cause mortality, which is basically like die sooner from the same things we've been talking about this entire video. You guys getting the trend here? You catching on to what we're getting after? One more time to bring it home. Quick lay summary of deficiency in magnesium, then I swear we're done. We see increases in chronic inflammation, crappy glucose control, and increased vascular stress. And we know athletes and high-stress individuals burn through magnesium faster. Therefore, more frequent supplementation and higher dosages throughout the day are probably more ideal. And then subtle deficiencies that might be missed on routine blood work can have fairly serious risks, as we just saw above with some of those key takeaways. And lastly, strategic magnesium repletion is a performance enhancer, an overall health protector, cardiometabolic protector, resulting in a decreased risk of death rate and early death, basically, to sum it all up. So that's the magnesium deep dive. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know it was a little more all over the place in the vitamin C deep dive. I just feel like there was so much overlap between the different body systems. It was kind of hard to have segregated sections, but bear with me. Thank you guys all for watching. As always, please comment, like, and subscribe to my channel for more content. I had some stuff going on in life. Things are a little more settled. I'm hoping to get back to some more content making soon. I'm considering vitamin D as my next video, but I'm always open to ideas and suggestions. I'm trying to hit some of the bigger minerals and vitamins first that have a lot more kind of nuance to them. It does take me quite some time to go through and put these together and actually dig through all the research and compile everything and give you guys nice, neat citations and the whole nine. So bear with me. Again, my plan is to have a little more frequency of posting going forward with content. So thank you guys. Welcome back to the Vital Dose for another one. And until next time.